My friends, I come to you today with solemn news. A dear friend of ours has tragically passed away, and at such a young age too, barely in their teens. I am of course talking about data center proxies. Those scrappy little can-do IP addresses that were beloved by scrapers the world over. But have rumors of the death of data center been greatly exaggerated? Yes and no. It might be best to think of these proxies as being on life support or hoping a miracle cure might save them. Or it might be best to just drop this tortured analogy and talk about the state of proxies in 2023. If you don't know me, I'm Isaac Coleman, a tech writer, computer scientist, movie collector, and vice president of marketing at Rayobyte. We're the largest proxy provider in the United States and one of the largest data center providers in the world. But hey, it's all about what you do with it, right? What I'll be talking about today is the current state of proxy technology, what's not working, what may work in the future, and then we're going to move from theory to practice with a little exercise that'll help you pick the best proxy technology stack for your use case. We're going to be doing that by calculating something called cost per scrape, which is a factor of the finance conception of cost of goods sold, or COGS. And I just saw the soul of every developer in this room die, but it's going to be okay. We have a paper handout for those of you here in the room if you're joining us virtually or would prefer to have something that does the math for you. You can also go to rayobyte.com/worksheet and find it there. But before we get into that, let's talk about the death of data centers such as it is. The current state of data center proxies, we're going to be using some real examples from my company and others like us, although these will have to be anonymized. So, like I said, we started as a purely data center proxy provider. Our CEO, Neil, who's with me today, was much like me, an early adopter of search engine optimization, back in the good old days when search engines were still pretending not to be evil, and SEOs weren't pretending not to be evil. Just pages and pages of hideous, obviously fraudulent links as far as the algorithm could see. It was glorious. So then, as now, it's very important for marketers to understand where their pages are ranking in comparison to other pages on search engine results. All your favorite search engine tools rely on huge amounts of real-time, bot-collected data straight from the SERPs. 5 years ago, we specialized in getting this data at blazing fast speeds. So much so that we called ourselves Blazing SEO. But in the past 5 years, the use of data center proxies to scrape search engines has dropped by more than 90%. You can see the impact this had on our own revenue here, and our colleagues in the industry saw a similar decrease. Why? Because search engines, especially the largest search engine, have put a lot of time and money into anti-scraping technology. And because data center proxies have the lowest authority of any proxy type, they tend to get banned fast and they get banned in bulk. So it's no longer worth the economies of scale required to use these to scrape Google. Let me now talk about a social media use case, specifically a photo-based social media site with a lot of a big influencer culture and a lot of opportunity for pay-per-click advertising. So as you can imagine, this is something that marketers also want to know the performance of their accounts on. And on August 7th, 2019, this social media site in question was completely scrapable. But on August 8th, 2019, that was no longer the case. The company that owns this social media site, a much larger social media site in their own right, threw up mass bans that banned more than a few of their own regular users, threw up login screens every 4 feet, and vastly limited access rates. Now, on August 7th, this site alone accounted for 40% of Rayobyte's revenue. And since August 8th, we've had no one scraping the service. Imagine losing half of your revenue overnight to anti-scraping. That's what happened to us, and it could happen to you as well, especially if you find yourself in the e-commerce industry. Now, right now, this is the #1 use case for data center proxies. It's this perfect combination of lots of high bandwidth pages, lots of images, video, animations, etc., but with very tolerant rate limits as well. And right now, no major e-commerce seller has banned data center proxies, so hey, why not use them? Except the largest e-commerce website has actually banned one use case for data center. You see, this particular website lets sellers buy sponsored listings that go at the top of their results, much like certain modern search engines. And if you look at them with a data center, you no longer see those sponsored results. Now, allegedly, the company in question had a good reason to do this. They were supposedly being pressured by the US government for charging for too much click fraud, right? Bots would access the site with a data center proxy, look at and click on ads, and users would be charged for that. And that's a use case we obviously don't condone. What's important about this is less the use case itself, although it does make ad verification with scraping impossible, and it makes it impossible to see what companies are bidding on what queries with data center proxies. What's important to understand is this means that the largest e-commerce website could ban data center proxies outright. They have that technology. They could do it overnight, just like our social media website did. They could do it today. Now, by our math, the market for data center proxies has shrunk by over 20% just since the beginning of 2022. If these e-commerce sites started implementing a mass ban, that wouldn't quite get the market all the way to zero, but it would be close enough. So what are the alternatives? And more importantly, should you stop using data center proxies? Based on everything we've talked about so far, you might think the answer is an obvious yes, but not necessarily. This is where we're going to start talking about cost per scrape. And again, this is where the paper handouts come into play, or again, you can find this at rayobyte.com/worksheet. What we're going to be doing here is starting to understand how all of this affects you as people interested in using proxies for scraping. So, again, we're going to be talking about cost per scrape. And one thing I want to make clear is that cost per scrape is not cost per proxy. The price of the proxy is actually only one of 3 buckets of cost you need to consider, along with computational resources, computational resources that are required for scraping, as well as the development resources you are paying for who are building and maintaining your scrapers. So all of these factor into your cost per scrape. Now, starting with the price of the proxy, this is where the type of IP address you're using matters, and I'm going to go through a brief primer on what you need to know because obviously there's more things than just price that go into choosing a particular proxy type. One thing that's important to understand is the difference between rotating and static proxies. Rotating proxies tend to be a lot more popular in the scraping world. And in this case, the IP address you're putting into your scraping tool actually represents connections to a large number of IP addresses, and it rotates between these connections in a set amount of time. These proxies are generally charged per gigabyte. Now, on the other hand, static proxies are just the proxy list, right? The IP addresses you buy are the ones you get. Once they're banned, that's it. But these are usually charged per IP, which makes them incredibly much cheaper. So why aren't they used as much? Well, the main reason is because in order to use static proxies effectively, you're going to need some kind of discrete proxy manager microservice. This is a screenshot of ours. Now, the purpose of a service like this, as Shane just talked about, would be to auto-detect bans, rotate your connections to new IPs automatically, etc. And this is the emerging technology to look out for in the proxy space, is improvements to proxy managers. In fact, I'm sure it won't be long before we have AI intelligently routing your traffic to the right IP address at the right time to minimize cost per scrape. Now, going a little more granular here, and again, I know some of you already know this, but moving on from static or dedicated data center proxies and rotating data center proxies, we then have ISP proxies. And by the way, if you're paying for a product that calls itself static residential, this is what you're paying for, ISP proxies. These are also static IPs. They're also located in a data center, but they are associated with a residential internet service provider, such as Comcast, which gives them a little more authority, makes them a little harder to ban. Then, of course, there's residential proxies, everyone's favorite, a rotating option that is not only associated with an internet service provider, but also with a real device rather than just a server rack. Finally, you have mobile proxies, which have all of the above, plus a technology called CGNAT that's offered by telecom providers. Put simply, for the sake of time, CGNAT means that every mobile IP address is actually being used by thousands of users at the same time, which means that they're almost impossible to ban. They have crazy high rate limits. But since these proxies are not very available right now and complex to implement, they're usually out of the affordability range of most data extractors who need millions of IP addresses. So, enough talk about proxy type. Let's see how this actually applies to proxy cost. These numbers are closely based on a real customer of ours. This customer scrapes the largest e-commerce website 4 billion times per month. They gather around 2 petabytes of data per month. And they do this using 37,000 static data center IP addresses. At a cost of $1 per IP per month, that's a total proxy cost of $37,000. And yes, I'm sorry, these are Yankee dollars. Now, if they were to use residential proxies at what seems like a lower cost of 50 cents per gigabyte instead of $1 per IP, because they're scraping 2 petabytes of data, that brings their total proxy cost to $1 million per month, which is 30 times higher. So if this site this customer in question were scraping sponsored listings, if they were specifically doing retail advertising analytics, they would be forced to have this 30 times increase in cost. Now, of course, getting 4 billion scrapes at 37,000 IPs required this customer to build their own in-house proxy manager, which is an expense unto itself, but you can see how hiring the development staff to do that could still be cheaper than using rotating residential proxies. So that's proxy cost. That's the first bucket of cost per scrape. The second bucket is your computing resources. This is what you're actually paying AWS, Azure, what have you, for resources such as processing time and memory. Now, as with proxies, obviously, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different considerations that go into which computing resource provider you want to choose, your actual costs, etc. But the single biggest decider of costs in the scraping world for computing resources is whether or not you can do curl-like requests, which means you're just getting the text or HTTP from a website, or if you need to do browser-based scraping. If you're getting full HTML or images or video or something like that, that's going to be a lot more expensive in terms of computing power. But on the other hand, curl-like requests, that's not really how humans tend to access the internet. So sites with strong anti-botting measures are more likely to catch them and ban them. Now, you can offset the lack of authority of curl-like requests by using a more authoritative type of proxy, like residential proxies. But would that actually be cheaper than doing browser-based scraping with data center? So you see, without actually diving into the numbers, it's hard to know which is less expensive. Even though in some of our testing, we found for certain use cases, these two approaches could have pretty similar success rates. And that's a point I really want everyone here to understand today. You can make just about anything work in terms of a proxy technology stack, especially if you're just willing to brute force it. But just because it's working does not mean that it's the best option for your use case, or more importantly, the best for your cash flow. And then the final bucket of cost is what are you actually paying the developers who work on your scraping services? As we've already said, building an in-house proxy manager for static proxies versus using rotating proxies, this has different cost implications. Likewise, are you building your scraping tools in-house or using a third-party scraping API? I'm not going to go super in-depth into this. If you want to know how to calculate personnel costs, you'll have to come to a different conference. So, looking at the worksheet now, let's walk through some real scenarios of how different proxy technology stacks affects your bottom line. And what this worksheet is intended to do is not to allow you to break down your costs at the most granular level. We're going to be pretty simple ballpark numbers here. But what it is intended to do is give both development leads who may not think about cost that often and business leads who may not understand all the minutiae of scraping with a high-level understanding of what are the factors that go into choosing the best proxy technology stack and how do they affect that decision. So, The first question, very simple. What's your monthly computing resource cost? I'm going to assume everyone basically knows what you're paying, AWS, Azure, what have you. There's also the question of whether you can use text-only, curl-like requests, or whether you need browser-based tools for scraping. Pretty simple stuff. For our example, let's say our cost is $2,000 per month, and we can use curl. Next up is the proxy costs, and this is as simple as looking at the latest invoice from your proxy provider, but if you'd like to just do some napkin math here in the room, maybe compare some different things, we've gotten from our friends at Proxyway the average enterprise proxy pricing costs across all providers, rounded to the nearest 50 cents. Let's say we're using static data center. It is what we've been talking about after all. So it's $1.50 per unit. The unit is IP addresses. Let's say we have 50,000 for a total of $75,000 in proxy costs. Let's say we're scraping 1 million gigabytes of data in a given month. Now this isn't super important for us right now because we don't have per gigabyte pricing, but it's going to come into play later. Finally, our development resource costs, let's say $8,000 a month, that's a couple of full-time devs, and let's say we're doing 100,000 scrapes in a given month. So with all that, calculating cost per scrape is pretty easy. Our costs are $2,000 for computing resources, plus $75,000 for proxies, plus $8,000 for developers is $85,000 total cost, divided by our 100 million scrapes. That's 85 thousandths of a cent in cost per scrape per month, which sounds about right. Now, of course, you don't have to do this monthly when you're doing these calculations. If you pay for your proxies or your computing resources on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis, perfectly fine to do it that way as well, so long as you're being consistent, right? All your math is quarterly, all your math is annual. And that's it. That's cost per scrape. It's a very basic version of it. You can do a more advanced version when you get home. But how does this basic arithmetic, tie into what I was talking about at the start of the presentation? Well, what this cost per scrape concept does is it gives you a way to think about and talk about the real-life impact of something like the so-called death of data center. So remember the customer I talked about who was scraping sponsored listings and so had to switch from data center to residential proxies and had that 30 times proxy cost increase. Let's actually model that or something similar to that now with cost per scrape. So let's say that data center proxies stop working for my use case and I need to switch to ISP proxies. Because these are still static, they're generally still charged per IP rather than per gigabyte. But the cost has doubled now. It's $3 per IP instead of $1.50, bringing my total proxy cost to $150,000 a month. Assuming everything else stays the same, I need the same number of IP addresses and everything, our cost per scrape is now $0.0016 per month. So my proxy cost doubled, but my total cost per scrape didn't quite. Maybe I'm still doing okay. But now the anti-botting measures are getting even worse. Now I have to switch to residential. So residential cost, the average cost we provide is $1 per gigabyte. But remember, my answer to question 2A, I'm scraping 1 million gigabytes of data per month, which, as I'm sure you all know, is not in any way unreasonable. That means my total proxy cost is now $1 million per month, a $925,000 increase that brings my total cost per scrape per month to 1/100th cent. That's more than 6 times what ISP proxies were costing me. That's more than 11 times what data center proxies were costing. Now, let's even say that maybe I can fire my development team because since I've switched from static to rotating proxies, I no longer need a static proxy manager. This is, of course, not how this would work in real life, but let's just give me the best possible chance of making my money back here. All that would do is take off this last 1/100th cent in terms of cost per scrape per month. So it would actually be cheaper for me to keep using static proxies and hire a $900,000 a month development team than it is to make the switch to rotating proxies. So for those of you who are using some kind of rotating proxy, residential or otherwise, it's worth asking yourself today, is that because it's the only option that works with my use case, which is possible? Is that because it's the most profitable option for me, which is also possible? Or did it just seem like the easiest option at the time? Did it seem like the path of least resistance? Because if it's the latter, you may be missing out on a lot of profit, even if you just use ISP proxies instead of data center. And of course, proxy cost is only one of the buckets of cost we have to consider. Another thing we see, another impact often of anti-scraping measures improving, is that a site stops allowing curl-like text-only requests and requires something more computation-intensive, perhaps browser-based Puppeteer. Now, curl-like requests, HTTP requests with curl, use almost no RAM whatsoever. Whereas modern browsers, as we all know, use tons of RAM. Every single browser launch is going to be a few hundred megabytes of RAM all on its own. So that's obviously going to increase your memory costs a lot. Now there's ways to offset this. You can reuse an instance, or you can use multiple tabs on the same instance, but each of these solutions may have downsides as well, including cost downsides. Without actually testing your use case with both curl-like requests and browser-based scraping requests, it's impossible for us to say exactly what the cost increase would be. But in all of our testing, across, as you can imagine, a very large number of use cases, we have found that the cost almost always increases by at least 2 factors of magnitude. So going back to our example numbers, and you can work through this in part 4 of the worksheet, our $2,000 a month computing costs have just increased to $200,000 a month, bringing our total cost per scrape to almost 0.3 of a cent, and over 3 times increase from the original, even though we're using still data center proxies in this example. So, and again, this is maybe the minimum cost that you have to deal with, is this times 100. It could be much higher. It could be as high as times 500. Now, just like Shane said, we can't control anti-botting measures. We don't get to decide when a particular website becomes more difficult or more expensive to scrape. But what we can do is plan for these things and prepare for them. You should be asking questions like, am I currently using the cheapest viable proxy technology stack for my use case? And if so, have I modeled what a cost increase might look like if I have to switch to a more expensive form of scraping? Am I in communication with others in my industry about what threats are looming, right? If it's the e-commerce industry, do I know about that sponsored listing thing? Do I know that the largest e-commerce site could ban data center proxies outright anytime it wants? Am I factoring these things into my SWOT analyses? Most importantly, does my business model factor in cost per scrape? Because I know many of the people I'm talking to here, you're not offering a scraping service yourself, you're offering a service that relies on scraping in some way. So right now, these sorts of things may not be your greatest expenses. But I hope you understand that after today, they could be, and they could be very quickly. You need to make sure that your pricing and your revenue projections are staying ahead of any potential increases to cost per scrape. Now, all that may sound a bit dire. Anti-scraping, obviously not ideal for many of us, but I'm not here to be the doom and gloom guy. I'm here as a representative of a company which, as mentioned, lost 40% of its revenue overnight. A company that made its name with a product that is now allegedly dying, and a company that is now more profitable than ever. If we were able to weather these storms with proper planning, I know all of you in this room can as well. So where does that leave us today? Well, data center proxies aren't quite dead yet. And even if they go, the concept of proxies in a data center will have long legs thanks to the development of ISP proxies. But there are real threats out there, especially that one in the e-commerce industry. More importantly, even if none of this particularly affects you, the real threat isn't in one particular type of proxy phasing out. It's in the rising costs in all areas of the industry. It's these big mega corporations deciding that publicly available web data belongs to them, but not to you. So I hope today I've given you a useful framework for thinking about and planning for these changes long term. As we've seen yesterday and as we'll see today at this very conference, the future of scraping is a long and bright one. And the proxy industry will always be right there to support it. Thank you.
So now I get to ask you some questions.
Yes.
Oh, we have a few. All right, so I don't have to ask you any. Let's go. Actually, I do have a question before we go through this. So do you really see data center proxies dying?
What?
Do you really see the data center proxies dying out?
I think they will. I think probably within the next 3 to 5 years, we will see them, die out. But I think we'll see them be not practical, right? Like, technically, you can still scrape social media with data center proxies. It's just that you're going to get banned at such a high rate, you'd have to buy, hundreds of millions, maybe billions to do it effectively. So, IPv4 IP addresses will still be around, but I do think that as a viable tool for scraping, we'll see them just become obsolete, yeah.
Okay, so thank you. First top question from Anonymous, quite a popular user. We're seeing the price of both static data center and ISP IPs going up every year, specifically ISP. Is this a factor of higher demand and less availability?
Not necessarily. I would say it has more to do with rising costs in other areas, inflation in other areas of the business. Like I know for us, when we do a price increase, it's because one of those other buckets, right? Maybe we're having to pay more for developers, even if we have the same number of developers. Maybe we're having to pay more for computing costs, something else it could be. Again, like what I'm talking about here is a very narrow subset of total expenses. There are a lot of rising costs in other areas of the industry that may cause prices to increase as well. But I don't see the availability of ISP or data center going anywhere. If anything, again, it's the opposite. As the demand for data center is increasing, all these IPv4 addresses still exist, right? So if anything, it's maybe easier to get a hold of them now because they're in such less demand.
And we have a classic question here about the testing side of it. So, obviously anybody trying to launch a service wants to try and figure out, whether these things are going to, work before you buy. So Assad has asked a question about, how do you test residential or data center proxy services before buying it?
Sure. So, the best way to test it is just to do a very small scale version of whatever you're going to be doing on a larger scale. I would certainly recommend testing both with kind of the text-only HTTP approach, which doesn't just have to be curl. I'm using the phrase curl-like, and a browser-based approach. But, with our company, as with most others, you simply request a free trial. You get a small number of IPs. You really only need like maybe 1 gigabyte, maybe even less, a few megabytes if you're doing residential to get a good test. And then with static proxies of any kind with data center, it may be a little more difficult because, obviously you're not rotating several different types of proxies, but still very, easy to test, very possible to do so.
Okay, so we have an Outlook question, about alternative proxies like residential and mobile. Do you see them dropping significantly over time, like general computing costs?
This is a very good question. I do think probably the prices, especially mobile, will drop over time. Mobile right now costs so much because it's so hard to acquire. Residential is also a little difficult to acquire if you're doing it ethically. I wouldn't dare suggest that anyone in the proxy industry is doing otherwise, but I would be, available during the networking sessions, and who knows what I might say. But I do think that, yes, as these pools become larger, again, especially mobile right now, mobile's like brand new as far as being used for scraping. Obviously, the concept itself is not new. And so I do think these costs will probably drop over time. And I think as far as we know for now, right, as I'm standing in this room, October 2023, residential and mobile will probably work forever because you can't mass ban them the way you can data center proxies because, of course, real users use residential IP addresses, right? Whenever any of us here who's using a phone or a laptop right now is connecting with a residential IP address. So sites don't want to ban these en masse the way that they can with we don't ever want to get access by any proxy that's like in a data center that isn't associated with a real device. We'll just block those outright. It'll block a small number of our real users. So right now we do see these kind of being the forever product for proxies. Again, who knows what may be in the future, but right now there's no known technology to mass ban them.
Okay, so we've about 10 seconds left, so I'm going to ask you one last question, and you can answer all the rest of them at the breakouts. So apparently IPv6 is going to solve everything?
How relevant is IPv6? IPv6 proxies can be better than IPv4 proxies because they are often clean. For those who don't know, this is the IP address version 4 and version 6. Version 4 is the one that's being used forever. It's starting to get phased out. China has actually said they're not buying or creating any more IPv4 IP addresses. And so IPv6 is the new one. How relevant is it? Right now, it doesn't work with a lot of websites. A lot of websites are like, I don't recognize this IP address type, and we'll ban them outright. I would also say they're pretty much going to have the same problems as standard data center, which means that, yes, for some things, they work great. They're way more available. They're super cheap. They're clean. They might work slightly better than your IPv4 data center proxies, but you can still expect similar rate limits and ban rates.
Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you.